So I'm going to give you a bit of information about one of the pilot projects under the CABI program from Isla Cabritos. And once again, Island Conservation was invited by the ministry and by CABI to assist with this project at various stages in its implementation. The species we were really interested in is an endemic iguana. This is called Record's iguana. It's extremely rare. It's critically endangered, IUCN listed, and it has a very, very small distribution. This is Hispaniola. Its distribution is only in this tiny part of Hispaniola, and a small population in Haiti was discovered just a couple of years ago. Probably population's probably somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 individuals, but it is actually declining, most likely partly due to ongoing impacts such as charcoal burning, loss of habitat, poaching, and invasive vertebrates, but also because of some of its habitat is being lost to the rising of Isla Cabritos Lake, which Carlos spoke about on our first day. So this is Isla Cabritos. It's an inland island within this very large lake, Lake Enriquillo. These are the other two pilot projects, just for reference, that I talked about earlier. And it is the only below sea level lake in the entire Caribbean. It's extremely hot. The island itself is about 1,900 hectares, I think now, as Carlos explained. It's actually losing land because of the lake level rising, which I'll talk about in a minute. In addition to the Record's iguana, the other endangered species on Cabritos that use Cabritos that we're interested in is the American crocodile. It has a very good population there. It's been well protected over the last 10 years or so. And the rhinoceros iguana, palm crow, and a number of other IUCN-listed species. It's also within the Jaragua National Park, within the larger Lake Enriquillo and sorry, it's not Jaragua, it's Isla Cabritos and Lake Enriquillo National Park. It's also within the larger biosphere reserve, which Altavelo was also in. It's also a wetland site, an important bird area, key biodiversity area. It's a really important site. And Carlos mentioned this on the first day about the lake level rising. So the Record's iguana are on the island here, but also along the shores here. This is one of the main populations in this area. And this pink area here is the flooding that's been happening over the last sort of 4 or 5 years and losing iguana habitat. Plus, the local communities that live around here are losing their farmland as well. So that's putting more pressure on the iguana habitat. But what it also has done, Carlos mentioned about the land bridge. This is 2003. You can see there's a land bridge here, which enabled a lot of domestic animals to come across. There's also a bit of a land bridge here. But what it's done now with the lake level rising is it's given us this very good opportunity to actually remove the invasive vertebrates from the island and make it into a sort of invasive-free refuge. And at the moment, it's not looking like the land bridge will reform for quite a long time. So remaining on Cabritos was burros, and these were probably domestic animals that were grazing there and then just sort of abandoned, but as the lake level rose. But this was the primary interest of the pilot project, was to remove the feral burros. And these have a lot of impact. It's a very sandy sort of area, so you get this change in vegetation communities. These are sort of resistant to browsing. You can see they do damage to the cacti. They get a lot of soil erosion by opening up the habitat. And they also directly impact the iguanas by digging for water. So they dig into the nests, they eat iguana food, and they destroy the nest burrows. But we were also interested in the cats. Isla Cabritos has a population of feral cats, and those are very well known to have a significant impact on these big cyclura rock iguanas. In Puerto Rico, they're very heavily impacted. There's an endemic species there. It's been well studied, and the feral cats there, often analyzing stomachs, you find iguanas in them. So very quickly, this is the sort of timeline, very general timeline of how the project played out. The ministry started, it was part of a bigger program which the ministry managed. So the ministry started a sort of invasive species strategy and planning back in 2009. Island Conservation was asked to assist with a feasibility plan. And I mentioned this here, highlighted this here because I want to talk about it in a bit. In 2010, the ministry then initiated the removing animals alive, which Carlos talked about for the local community. Here, they actually did the early survey. They did baseline surveys, about 127 animals. Then they started removing them for the community, started doing some cat trapping. Island Conservation was invited in 2013 to help to continue that progress, and we actually were able to obtain a bit more money just earlier this year to continue the project. But in between here are gaps of actual fieldwork, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a situation currently right now. Since 2012, when the first Burros were removed alive, the total project has removed 134 Burros from the island and 163 cats. And this is an incredibly high number of cats for an island that is only, 1,500, 1,900 hectares. We were very surprised at the density of cats given the really dry environment. But some recent surveys, we just did some recent surveys in March, suggests that we still have animals remaining. This is a sort of an estimate, high, medium, and low. This is the lowest, and this is the high. And still about 30-odd Burros remaining. So the project has no more money, so it is incomplete. And what I want to do is just go through a number of sort of best practices and principles about eradication projects that we learned during this process, and illustrate them with the Cabritos project. So what I want to do is lessons learned from the fact that this is an incomplete. And I would say the project is continuing. The partnership is getting more money and is committed to finishing it. So lesson number one, and this is a principle, I think I showed them yesterday. One of the principles for eradication is that the techniques that you decide to use must be able to remove all of the animals. So if you have any animals that's going to avoid whatever techniques you're putting in, like a trap or a snare or something like that, then you're unlikely to achieve successful eradication. And so one of the reasons why the Burros haven't been completely removed so far is we believe is that right at the beginning, not enough different techniques were planned for in order to remove the last remaining animals. So the ministry removed about 99 or 100 animals alive for the community, which is very successful. But once the animals get to such a low density, capture rates become inefficient. It becomes very expensive. They're only capturing, one a week or one every couple of weeks. And so the capture efforts were actually stopped, with still probably about 30-odd animals remaining. And what then happened was Island Conservation were invited in 2013 to try and continue some of this work, but there was a hiatus of about several months in between while we decided what other methods could be used to remove the remaining animals. And that hiatus would have meant that there was breeding going on and animals were being recruited into the population. So you were losing ground in terms of being able to achieve complete eradication. And the hiatus was required to identify the methods, to get all the tools and techniques in place, to field trial them on the island, and to actually start removing more animals. And our recommendation basically is that you need to sort of have a number of different techniques identified right at the beginning, and you have a progression of techniques that you're already planned for, so you don't lose time, you don't lose ground in completing all removals. And this is sort of another reason why, is because in order to complete eradication, you need to be able to remove the animals more quickly than they can breed. So you don't want gaps in your field operations time. At the start of this is for feral cats, the start of the program in 2012, a number of cats were removed. About 31 cats are removed with 34 traps, one field staff across a timeline of 5 months. Then it was stopped for various reasons. In 2013, Island Conservation was invited to assist, And we managed to we recruited a local field team, which I'll talk about in a minute, and their team of 6 staff across a period of 6 months removed 136 cats using 2 different types of methods. So the 2013 capture results suggest that the 2012 methods, 31 cats in 5 months compared to 136 cats in 6 months, the 2012 methods were probably not sufficient to remove cats in a reasonable time frame, to completely remove all cats in a reasonable time frame. There weren't enough being removed, and the young animals that would have been born during the sort of operations would have just replaced the animals that were being removed. So you probably wouldn't have achieved eradication with that one method and one staff. In addition to which, the trapping was stopped between July 2012 and March 2013, and so any ground gained by removing animals was probably lost, because there would have been a lot of young animals born into the population in that 8-month period. In addition to live trapping, Island Conservation introduced a second technique, which means you can target, cats that may not like going into traps. And we actually developed some raised, elevated leg hold traps, which meant that we wouldn't capture any iguanas. And that was really critical, not to accidentally capture any iguanas. And this is one of our staff working with the local field team on developing this technique. Lesson number 3 is that the risk of reinvasion must be 0 or be able to be managed effectively. And we talked a lot about this yesterday. We believe this was, very efficiently carried out by the Ministry of Environment. Alongside this project, the Ministry put in a pretty large outreach program to local communities. A lot of communities living around the lake, and a lot of communities still use the island as a base for fishing from. So they conducted a lot of outreach to the communities through the duration of the project, and this certainly assisted in ensuring that the communities wouldn't intentionally put burros or even goats and other domestic animals back on the island. In addition, we did initial training back in January and March 2013. We had some ministry folks attended that, a local NGO, CFO, and also we worked with another local NGO which manages tourists visiting the island, and they assisted us with the logistics. So this sort of accumulation of knowledge of what was happening and what the goals of the project were amongst the local community, I think, was a really important factor in making sure that intentional reintroduction none of the communities actually intentionally reduced domestic animals after they had been removed. It's also a protected area, so there is a legal system in which to be able to manage biosecurity on the island. Lesson number 4, the methods that you choose for an eradication must be supported by the public, politically acceptable, and socially acceptable. And this was certainly a good lesson for us, for Island Conservation, when we worked on this project. The strategy that we'd recommended in 2010 in the feasibility plan was initial live removal, followed by hunting from the air using helicopters and from the ground. And Carlos mentioned about this on his evaluation at the beginning of the week. Aerial eradication is really a fairly commonly used tool for eradications globally, particularly for large projects, and it can actually be quite cheap when you compare it to the long-term effort of a ground operation. Initially, we had estimated you'd probably only need about 6 to 10 hours of flying time, and you could achieve near completion of the burros in 2 or 3 days, compared to sort of 2 or 3 years, which is this now has been going on for. And while the live removal really addressed the social concerns, and that was one of the main motivators, incentives for the ministry to do that, it certainly did address the social concerns. As the only technique, it would unlikely have removed all of the animals. And again, a second or third technique did need to be planned for. And right at the beginning of the program, we hadn't appropriately consulted with the communities about the acceptability of an aerial hunting operation. As far as we understood it, the aerial hunting operation wasn't really well supported because of various sort of historical associations of military maneuvers and etc. So this was a real lesson learned for us. Okay, I'll run through quickly this. Funding has been an issue. Obviously, it's incomplete and there's no more money left. And so really, the key here is that right at the end of the project is the most expensive and most cost, the time when you need most effort. In other successful eradications, it has been estimated that 40% odd of the effort and the cost is spent just on the last few animals. And I just wanted to show you this. It's a bit of a complex graph, but given that our early discussion on Monday was about bioeconomics, this is a bioeconomic study of a goat eradication carried out in the Galapagos Islands in 2001 to 2006. And there's a couple of things learned here. If you focus on the black here, you'll see this is a number of goats killed. Over time, you get a general decline in the number of goats killed. The reason for these spikes is because they did different types of techniques at different stages. So you get this decline. And then tailing off to the very, very few last animals. And if you look at the red line, this is cost per animal. So right at the beginning, when you're just doing a ground operation, your cost is pretty low. It was, on average, it was about $70 a goat. But this last phase, which took nearly a year, the cost of the animals spikes really, really high. And that's because this is when you're looking for those last few animals. And this is pretty typical of eradications, of not rodents, but of all the sort of ungulates and cats eradications. And from a budgetary perspective, this is what you have to plan for, because this is where your project is going to stop too soon because it's getting too costly. So you really have to know that you've got enough money in your budget to be able to remove those very, very last few animals. The other quick thing, right at the beginning of the project, we didn't know that there were these cows on the island, 40 or 50 odd cows, and this really did compromise the efficiency of removing the donkeys because they interfered with some of the traps that we had. So you really need to know the eradication environment right at the beginning in order to be able to plan. And had we known, we probably could have put in traps that would have techniques that would have removed both cows and donkeys at the same time. Without removing the cows, you're not going to get the full benefit of recovery from removing the donkeys, because the cows are just going to have much the same impact. This is a local field team. One of the biggest, one of the really great outcomes of this was we were able to build this fantastic local field team. They've been extremely dedicated. They came with skills. They had previously been involved on a small mammal program called the Last Survivors, the endemic mammals of Dominican Republic, and we were able to put in training to fill the skills gap in eradication techniques. And they were working on they lived on the island. They worked on a 20-day on, 10-day off schedule, and that island is below sea level, so it gets to 130 degrees, I think was one of the temperatures that was recorded in the middle of the day. Incredibly hot, incredibly dry. And they worked really, really well as a team. And this is a very, very important part of a successful eradication. The project partnership, this is the project partnership. We communicated really well. We had monthly meetings. This is Jorge Broca from the Hispaniola Ornithological Society, who we recruited a lot of the field team through. Robert Ortiz, who is a field team leader. These are our two guys, Bob and Carlos, obviously, as you know. And we had these monthly meetings, plus lots of other sort of communications to resolve problems, get more funding, and think about management. So that was a really, really successful part of the good lesson learned, and it really contributed to the success. So thank you very much.